I'm just going to be up here for a couple of minutes to start the introductions, and let me start by introducing myself. I'm Robert Eisen. I'm a professor and chair in the religion department here at GW, and I wanted to welcome everyone to what promises to be a wonderful event. And I have to begin by thanking a number of programs and individuals inside and outside GW that made this event possible. First, I'd like to credit my own department. Today's event, as you may have noticed from the posters, is the annual Abi Ziffrin Memorial Lecture. And what this is an endowed lecture that the religion department sponsors every year in commemoration of a colleague who taught in our department in the 1980s and the 1990s. What we try to do is that we try to find a speaker in an area that was of interest to Abi Ziffrin. And today's lecture deals with Buddhism, and that definitely fulfills that criterion, because Abi, among other things, was a specialist in Eastern religion. She taught Hinduism, she taught Buddhism, Judaism, peace studies. She did a little bit of everything, but Buddhism was certainly one of her interests. But if we are not the only sponsors here today, this event certainly wouldn't have been possible without the help and co-sponsorship of others on campus, in particular the Sigger Center for Asian Studies, the Governance Project, as well as MACHIC, which is an organization that strives for global innovation on behalf of Tibet. I'd also like to thank a couple of individuals who did most of the work organizing this event. First of all, my wonderful colleague Eyal Aviv, who teaches courses in Buddhism in our department. Also, Tashi Rabge, professor of international affairs and director of the Tibet Governance Project. Both of these individuals worked tirelessly to make this event happen because I was preoccupied with events on the Jewish calendar during this month. I couldn't do as much of the work as I wanted to, and they really picked up the slack. There are also a number of individuals that need to be thanked. I can't name all of them, but I wanted to make special mention of Bruce Rich, along with sundry other supporters who helped in the organization of this event and making it possible. One person who's not here is Kamisha Cassidy, who's our office manager in the religion department, who also did a lot to coordinate things. But she took a couple of vacation days, which she's permitted to do once in a while. Without any further delay, I'd like to ask Tashi Rabge to come up and introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you, and I will just add one more thank you to that, which is to Rob for being so supportive of this idea since the day that we raised this idea that we would have Thupten Jinpa come and speak, and he was game. I just want to say how delighted we are to have this opportunity. For those of you who are part of the Tibet studies world or the Tibet policy interest world or the global Tibet world in general will know that he is, as someone said on social media the minute that we released notice of this talk, he is a Tibetan national treasure. And we're really delighted that he is now speaking publicly about topics that feel very urgent right now. He is really a master of two traditions, and most of us have come to know him through his work since 1985 as the principal translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so that being the case, he is the second most familiar face in the Tibet world. He's often talked about as a bridge between cultures, between knowledge traditions, between languages. That's how we've gotten to know Jinpa in his work since the past 30 years, he's really been at the center of the development of this whole dialogue centered within the Mind and Life Institute. He is currently the chair of the Mind and Life Institute, and as such, he really has been in the eye of a cultural storm, a real collision of different ways of knowing and different ways of thinking about our consciousness and about how we know, cognitive science in general. So being at that point of tremendous transition, Jinpa has been really in a unique position to be able to really speak across divides. And in particular, I think it's interesting for those of us who aren't in Buddhist scholarship or in religious studies. So those of us here, for example, at the Elliott School, we welcome this conversation today because of our interest in global ethics, because of our interest in secularity in the world today. And because we have now come across this earth-shattering idea that qualities such as resilience, such as kindness, such as happiness, that these aren't fixed and immutable, but perhaps that they can be changed. In fact, that they might be skill sets that can be learned, that can be shared. That being the case, there's this huge global interest right now in the idea of the mainstreaming of mindfulness. Right, and the mainstreaming of meditation and the scientific study of meditation. The question that we have for Jinpa is how does this become a global mainstream cultural phenomenon? Can it be stripped of a Buddhist tradition? Can it be stripped of Buddhist, as they say, metaphysics? And we would really be delighted to have a question and answer period following the remarks that Jinpa is going to be making now regarding where science is taking us and where voices like his should intervene. And so as we've seen Jinpa go through these different phases of his life, from when I was very young and just in awe of him, here is this monk that came from Dzongkha Monastery, and out of this monastery came this shining light who then went on to master two traditions, becoming this globally recognized face for Tibetan Buddhism to this new stage. He has released his book that's on sale out there, by the way. So following this, the formal part of this event tonight, we welcome people to purchase the book and to have a conversation with Jinpa in the reception afterward. But what we really look forward to is this next stage, the next phase, we hope, of his public life, which is to be a thought leader on these topics. So thank you.
Good afternoon, and I'm deeply honored to be invited to give this year's Abby Ziffrand University lecture here at the George Washington University. So at the beginning, I would like to express my deep appreciation to all the organizers, Machik and Tibet Governance Project, the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, as well as the Department of Religion here at the university. And also I would like to especially thank Professor Tashirabye for insisting that I come here. So I was able to fortunately fit it in because I happen to be, I have to come to this area because of the Mind and Life board meeting, which we had just finished in the Dallas area. And we chose the Dallas area because the Mind and Life office is now based in Charlottesville, and our president, Professor Susan Bao, who is actually, she's here. Susan, can you just stand up briefly? So, being based in Charlottesville, one of the things that we bought really when we asked Susan to take this challenging position as the president of this organization, one condition that we asked from her is the board meeting we held in the Dallas area, so the people can just fly in and then get out quite easily. Whereas Charlottesville you need another connecting flight. So thank you, Tashi, for your very warm introduction and welcome. And you referred to this, social media word, national treasure. The first time you said it, I was thinking of Ben Affleck's movie, National Treasure. I've been very fortunate to have quite a strange life. I'm part of the first generation of Tibetan refugee children. I wasn't even a year old when my parents left in 1959. So in a sense, I had a typical upbringing and childhood of Tibetan of my generation who are now in their mid-50s. Majority of our parents ended up working in the road construction camps because after the first few months of resettlement help, then you go to start supporting yourself. And since nobody spoke English or Hindi or had any means to cope with the local demands, most of them ended up, sorry, do I have to? Thank you. So most of Tibetans of my parents' generation ended up working in the road construction camp because all of a sudden India had this massive border, international border that needed to be guarded. So they have to build roads going all the way up to the Tibetan border. And who better than the Tibetans who are gifted to be, thriving in the high altitude. So that's how, and then of course that meant the children had to be, sent somewhere because you cannot just drag them along when you are working on road construction. So I, have this typical background. My background is not unusual. Where it became unusual is I chose to leave school after grade 4. I was so inspired by some examples of monks that I happened to interact with when I was a kid at school. I was so inspired by the examples. I just wanted to be like one of them. So I left school and chose a monastic path. With looking back, I really feel grateful I did it. And of course, then in '85, I was thrust into this public spotlight for, becoming His Holiness's personal interpreter. It's been a tremendous honor, a huge learning curve, because His Holiness's interest is so vast, and which meant that I also had to be. And His Holiness has many of you know, has a naturally curious mind and a very sharp intellect, and a deeply caring heart. So the combination of three things basically means that he's interested in pretty much everything that happens in the world, which meant that the person who is going to serve him as his main interpreter also need to catch up. I can no longer confine my interest just to, monastic interest or meditation or Buddhist thought, politics, all of this. And for me, it has been a tremendous learning experience. And having the privilege to serve him, and in the Tibetan Buddhist or Indian and Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is this idea of a bodhisattva. Bodhisattva is a truly compassionate being who has dedicated his or her life to serve others and the entire being. And they see service as the main vehicle through which they express this altruistic aspiration. So it's, although in the West sometimes we have this image of a Buddhist monk, completely shut off, probably just hiding in a cave somewhere. I mean, of course, there are those monks. Many of them are quite impressive meditators. But the Mahayana Bodhisattva ideal, a monk, is someone who's really in the world, serving the world. And in fact, His Holiness often says that, he gets up at 3:30, he has about 4 hours of meditation in the morning, and he says that he looks at this practice as a form of recharging his battery. Now, when you recharge your battery, what you do, you don't just conserve it, you have to use it. And the day-to-day activity during which he interacts with the larger world is the arena in which he actually uses that battery. So you can see in that vision of a monastic life, which is really very much part of the world and the service. So I've been very fortunate to be able to witness this. And Also, one of the really great blessings of my service to His Holiness has been the exposure to organizations like Mind and Life and its amazing series of dialogues, which has been truly educational. Of course, there was a personal journey as well. Of course, although, almost everybody in the outside world see me as an extension of His Holiness, as his, interpreter. And sometimes, people forget that I'm also another individual who has his own. And to begin with, I'm not a monk anymore. I'm a family man with 2 kids and all the rest. But I have also been very fortunate to be able to pursue my own intellectual journey while continuing to serve him. And this is one area where His Holiness has been truly compassionate. As I began serving him pretty much quite a lot, traveling with him to many international places, I was a monk then, and he said, right from the beginning, he said, don't think of joining my staff permanently. He said, that will be a waste of your talent. I'll call upon you when I need you, but you should develop yourself as an independent scholar. And that was a truly kind, because I knew that at that time that the office was getting a little annoyed. Here's a young Tibetan monk who needs to be constantly called, and they have to go through, make all this fuss. Whereas if he can just come up and be part of the staff, then we don't need to bother about, figuring out his time all the time. So, but His Holiness has been very, very kind. And so over time, of course, I had the opportunity to be at Cambridge, pursue my own intellectual development. I did Western philosophy. And that's when I started getting deeply interested in this whole kind of exchange of Buddhism and science, an encounter of Buddhism and modernity. And I come from a traditional Buddhist society. One of the things that I became very interested right from the beginning when I was at Cambridge was the impact on the people's religious belief at the societal level as a result of encounter of modernity and Western religious traditions. And I thought a lot about this whole notion of secularity. And also I became a great admirer of Western civic society and the political institutions that have emerged as a result of this whole Enlightenment. And I was particularly struck by the Kantian kind of statement that the categorical imperative, that the individuals should never be treated as a means to an end, but should be treated as an end in themselves. That idea is a powerful idea, which I would argue really formed the basis for the whole Western European thinking around the lines of individual freedom, respect for dignity, human rights, and so on. Of course, there were other people like Locke and Rousseau who were thinking along these lines, social contract theory, where does the legitimacy of the state comes in, whether it has to do with some form of consent has to be part of that process. Should the consent be always explicit? Is there such a way in which there could be a tacit form of consent? All of this is really, in some sense, built upon this idea of developing an institutional structure, thinking about society. And basically, what I see in this is trying to resolve this age-old tension between how do we balance the rights of an individual versus the well-being and needs of a collective society. And West really, maybe I'm being naive here, I'm not a political scientist. I do have a philosophical training. I took political philosophy as one of the subjects. But what I see in this kind of, evolution is essentially, at one point, Western society collectively making the decision. We will envision a society where our default position would be to trust the individual. Trust the individual, come up with a notion of a sanctity of the individual, and build some parameters around the individual to the point where, beyond which, if the collective needs to encroach, the collective needs to have a powerful reason to do so. And that idea really formed the basis for the whole conception of human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UN Declaration of Human Rights, is a powerful document coming out of this tradition. And I, as a Buddhist, would see that as almost like a kind of a spiritual document. It's one of those documents that has made a powerful contribution to the well-being of people across the world. So I began to think along these lines. But one of the things that really bothered me right from the start, actually I should say two things. One is the way in which even the structuring of the society, the whole conception of ethics around it, is very individual-centric. There's a notion that it's basically built from an individual. So all the society is conceived as a collection of atomistic kind of, individual discrete beings. And society is structured as a way of balancing the competing needs, and where there are some boundaries established which would require respecting a certain set of rights, which individuals, the state doesn't confer upon you, but you possess them by virtue of being a human being, by virtue of being a citizen. It's not something that the state confers upon you. If anything, you confer upon the state legitimacy through consent. But at the root of all of this is a notion of, basically the building blocks are individuals. And in that conception of society, there seems to be very little place for how relational, communal dimension of who we are really shaping the society. That was one thing that kind of intrigued me. Along with it, another thing that intrigued me is there is a kind of a deeply embedded idea for the scientifically educated people. It was more articulate, explicit, but for the larger society, it wasn't explicit, but there was this belief in a certain conception of human nature that is defined in very, very Darwinian terms. That, the basic human nature is that we are driven by pursuit of self-interest. That's the fundamental, ultimate explanation of human behavior. And, I was studying philosophy at Cambridge, and of course, philosophy students are very, very bright. And I remember having arguments where, I would say that this just doesn't make any sense. Yes, pursuit of self-interest is a powerful motivation, but there are so many competing motivations. We humans are such complex creatures. And we know from our own personal experience, we get triggered when we feel unfairly treated. We get triggered, we act when we feel compassionate. But where is all of that part of human nature, into the picture? There doesn't seem to be. It was a rather simplistic, reductionistic view that the basic human nature and ultimate explanation is really the pursuit of self-interest. So there was even a kind of attitude that if in explaining any human behavior, not just economic behavior, economy is the worst area where this was very, very explicit. Profit maximizers is the basic conception of human nature in economic theory. But in philosophy, in science, there was this basic attitude that if you haven't found a self-interest dimension to the explanation behind a particular human behavior, you haven't somehow found the final explanation of that behavior. It was that there was almost a kind of a dogmatic unwillingness to accept there are powerful competing motivations such as nurturing, caring, compassion. And that was one thing that, and around that time, His Holiness wrote The Ethics for the New Millennium, a book, which came out in 1989, I think. And in that book, one of the key message that he was bringing, and in fact an argument, there's a chapter on human nature there, and he was arguing that yes, pursuit of self-interest is a powerful human motive, we have to accept that, and it often manifests in the form of competitiveness, that's an expression at the behavioral level. But his argument was that equally powerful is another story, which is that the caring, nurturing, compassionate impulse that we have, which expresses in cooperative and helping behavior. And his argument was that if we don't come up with a human nature, picture of a human nature that combines both of these, we don't have a full picture. Now, this was in the early 80s that he was making that argument. And here I feel that his work, particularly in his advocacy of compassion, through this argument of human nature, that nurturing, caring is a basic impulse that we possess as empathetic social creatures. He even uses the word social animals. He often says in his public teachings that we are social animals. And as social creatures, we are, even from a Darwinian point of view, from an evolutionary point of view, we're equipped to interact. And so otherwise, why would we care when a total stranger gets hurt and it's bleeding? We don't stop when we see a total stranger get knocked down by a car and bleeding. We don't get to stop and say, do I know the person? Does this person speak my, language? Our basic human reaction is to feel for that person, to reach out. That's what makes us human beings. We are, thoroughly social creatures, So we are, of course, in the West, initially we prioritize the rational dimension of human beings. That was the human definition of human beings. Rational animal was the human being. Gradually, emotion came into the picture. Now we're emotional creatures. This is even quite recent, actually. The acknowledgement that emotion plays a powerful role in human motivation and choice is something that fairly recent in the West, actually, especially in the science. I remember when I was at Cambridge, a large part of the economic behavior was being, explained in terms of choice theory. And, those who took philosophy classes will know there's a very famous paper on choice theory, game theory by Ramsey. And we had to read it. I mean, it's mighty tough because there's a lot of equations thrown in there. So there was a tremendous obsession with trying to come up with some kind of algorithm that would explain the rational processes by which make the choice. But the reality is that most of us, if we bring rationality, often we bring it only as an afterthought. Once we have made the decision, as a rationalization. But the main force that motivates us often is emotion, whether it's anger or a sense of outrage or compassion and so on. So this is one area where I think His Holiness's argument really has been an important one. And this is one area where the Buddhism and science dialogue has really made an impact because, His Holiness constantly keep bringing compassion. And now, and part of that has to do with the independent development in the whole science. About 20 years ago, the whole sophisticated imaging technology began to emerge in the scientific world. We have now MRIs and so on. Before that, we didn't have those kind of technology to be able to look at brain in action, as it were. And also, neuroscience have a new concept, which is neuroplasticity, which is fairly recent, actually. And this discovery of plasticity offers the neuroscientist and other scientists a way of understanding how the mind works and the relationship between the mind and the brain and so on. So, of course, there were independent developments, but one of the key players really has been the work that His Holiness has done, and particularly through the Mind and Life series of dialogues, which constantly pushes the boundaries of this discussion and really and this is one area where I think the Buddhism and modernity interaction is an interesting one. Of course, now today we see, at the cultural level, a lot of effects of these kind of interactions, particularly in the area of mindfulness. Tashi mentioned a lot of, the phenomenon of mindfulness. These days, it's become a kind of a cultural meme, and a lot of people who use the word mindful this and mindful that probably may not be even aware of its Buddhist roots. So it has become that kind of normalized. But occasionally I do meet people in the East, particularly my colleagues from my own Buddhist scholarly background, and sometimes some of them raises the question. They say, "Oh yeah, it's just a cultural fad. You know what happened in the West. It's very materialistic. It's very individualistic. They will take what they think is helpful, but they will normalize it and Westernize it, and then look at the example of yoga. this is a typical example they give. Yoga, which in the traditional Indian context is a spiritual practice. There's a relationship between mind and body. Now, typical person on the street, when we say the word yoga, you think of a fancy posture and stretching. This is, and so that, and then, so you have cultural appropriations as they would see. And, some of my colleagues say, what makes you convinced that what is happening now between Buddhism and, secular West is not exactly the same as what's going to happen, what has happened with yoga. And once it is normalized, West will move on its own trajectory without being deeply affected. I don't think so. I think this new phenomenon that we are seeing is a different kind of story. I think in any interaction of two cultures at a deeper level, no party comes out unchanged. This has always been the case historically. Why wouldn't it be the same here? And the reason why I say this is because, for example, the impact on the conception of human nature, where now scientists were questioning. A large part of the questioning has come from mainstream scientists, particularly those who are working from child developmental psychology as well as non-human primate studies, when they observe the presence of empathy in non-human primates, like Franz de Waal's word, then you cannot start attributing it to kind of a religious culturation or conditioning. Maybe one can stretch it and say animals have rituals and all the rest. But once you see kind of rudimentary forms of compassion, which is expressed in empathy in non-human primates, then you have to take seriously. There must be some evolutionary roles for these kind of impulses to be there. So part of the challenge is coming from there. And once the fundamental conception of human nature begins to be shaped, this is going to have an impact. Because the whole edifice of modern economy is built on this Darwinian conception of human nature as someone who pursues just self-interest, the whole profit maximizers and all the rest. And in fact, there are now among economists, there's a small group of people known as neuroeconomists. They use neuroscientific methods to study economic behavior. And these people are looking at how emotions like fairness plays a role in influencing economic behavior. How does compassion, altruism, there's a whole, in Europe, there's even a phrase being used to characterize some of their work called caring economics. So I think this is going to have a profound change. And another change that is happening and where we don't see at the moment explicitly is the way in which the whole relationship between spirituality and science is being recast. Up until recently, in the West particularly, when we speak of science and spirituality, often we have a notion of two antagonistic perspectives, competing or arguing with each other. And of course, there are, very high profile, kind of atheist, a radical atheist who, critique the whole notion of, and so there is that kind of tension. But with the Buddhism coming as a new player in the field, it's kind of beginning to change that whole, kind of attention and developing an area, a way of doing it which is much more nuanced. And in fact, several years ago, the quite influential New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote an op-ed where he argued that this old-fashioned debate between religion and the science about whether or not one can prove the existence of God or whether the scientists can prove the non-existence of God is going to be not really that relevant in this new area. And this new area, what he was talking about is he says that there is an emergence of a new kind of scientists and thinkers who are comfortable with accepting the reality of spiritual experiences, including even mystical experiences, because they have a sophisticated understanding of the role of mind and brain. And this is where the term neural Buddhism came from. That's David Brooks' article. And he says that he might call that kind of neural Buddhism. And because he said these are ideas of scientists whose beliefs somehow fit a little bit with Buddhism. And the point he was making is that, they will be a different way of talking about science and spirituality relationship. And this is an area which needs to be explored. I hope someday they will maybe here at George Washington University, a PhD student, a smart person will take up this topic and then drill it down. This is where the PhDs are fantastic because you have the space and the time and the patience and the intellect to go really deep down, And this, I think, is an important area where, how this has changed. The other area is the whole conception of ethics and the development of a discourse on ethics that is kind of secular, but not secular in the way in which we understand in the West. Because in the West, when we use the word secular, we tend to use it as a contradistinction from the religious perspective, as a counter perspective. And, the secularity, of course, there's a difference between the continental European conception of that, particularly France, and the American conception of it. It's kind of somewhat similar, but France tends to be particularly quite militant when it comes to, defining what secularity is. And there is this real kind of, commitment to protecting the public space as being secular. But what is needed is to really open up this whole landscape of moral discourse, in the West. And this is one of those areas where I think the West will need to take it quite seriously because there are certain assumptions in the West which people who grew up in the culture may not be aware of, but someone like myself who comes from outside, now lives in the West, have been living in the West, educated in the West, can see. So those assumptions have to do with certain very, very fundamental ideas that are part of the emergence of the society. For example, one of the ways in which this whole religion and modernity and secular in the West, it has been resolved, the tension has been resolved, is to have a tacit agreement on the part of the larger society of a division of a public and a private domain. And you relegate religion and along with it morality into the private domain. And within the public domain, you have what some political philosophers have called very thin liberal moral theory. So in that public space, your kind of moral vocabulary is really confined to a small set of values that are all defined individually. That has to do with justice, fairness, rights, dignity. All of these are defined from an individual's perspective. So, and therefore, when we have situations where you need to bring kind of ethical consideration in the public discourse, say, for example, bioethics or technology, how do we bring ethical perspectives to bear upon technology, new innovations, and so on? There's a kind of a paucity in the language because you're forced to bring up values that are individually defined, either choice, freedom of choice, dignity, fairness, justice. We don't have the ability to bring more complicated moral values and qualities like compassion, because compassion is messy, it's relational, it's communal. We just don't have a way of bringing this up, and that's why, for example, one of the things that we are now beginning to see in the West is, when the economy was going up, there was a trickle-down kind of idea was kind of working. The bottom line was kind of, okay, these things don't pop up. But now we are seeing, particularly in this country, what we see currently in the election is an expression and frustration of so many individuals who feel somehow left behind and cheated. The system isn't serving them. Now, people may not be able to articulate in the way that I'm characterizing it, but a large part of that has to do with the fact that, there isn't enough compassion in the system. The system is all very rationally defined in terms of rights, choice, dignity. And this is one area I think the compassion, bringing Buddhism into the mix is going to really make a difference. Because historically, Buddhism stands as one of the very few spiritual traditions that has history of more than 2,500 years that have struggled with talking about ethics and morality without bringing in the metaphysical concept of a creator. Where the ethics and morality is grounded in a certain understanding of shared human condition and human needs and aspirations. Yet at the same time, it hasn't gone in the direction of secular Western humanistic thinking where the richness of the spiritual dimension is excluded. So this is one area where I feel that taking Buddhism seriously, and particularly the place of compassion seriously in our conception of moral thinking is going to be an important one. And already we see among the social scientists, those who have followed kind of this field called moral psychology, there was in the 80s a very important debate between Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan. And Carol Gilligan, her work really did quite a detailed study, field study, demonstrating that how just its orientation of ethics, ethical consideration, really reflects a certain gender bias. And whereas if you bring in the care dimension, then there is more of a balance. Whereas if you define ethics and ethical consideration and orientation purely from the justice point of view, there is a real gender bias. So that was a big argument. So already in the academic circles, there are debates taking place. And part of that has to do with not finding the right way to bring compassion into the picture in a way that is robust, that really speaks and resonates with us as human beings, and at the same time providing enough space, a kind of a broader public space where even the religious people as well as non-religious people can see and imagine a shared conception of ethics and morality that is robust, that is rich, that is not just thin liberal moral theory. And that, I think, will take a lot of work because at the moment, when we talk about secular versus the religious perspective, there is a kind of an antagonism. And on the part of the secular thinkers, to be honest, there is almost a kind of a negative attitude towards the religious perspective, sometimes being condescending, sometimes thinking that the religious people are being irrational. And on the part of the religious perspective, those who are deeply devoted, they tend to look at the secular people and say that they have no values, they have no morals, they're purely relativists. So that is not going to help. So what we need is a kind of a, instead of polarizing the discourse on morality between this thin liberal moral theory that is only allowed in the public domain versus this very rich, metaphysically flavored religious morality, what we need is something that would broaden and enrich the scope in the middle, where what is considered a kind of a public morality or shared morality or more ethical consideration and conception shared by the society is robust and rich, that even the religious people can relate to them and say, yes, that makes sense to me, that speaks to me. And this is one area where I think Buddhism can really play an important role, because this is, basically what Buddhism has done. Thinking about how do you ground, moral values without invoking divine laws, okay? How do you understand the moral sentiments? How is the intention connected with emotions which then lead to, behavior? What responsibility an individual has, and, a moral accountability. There's a lot of thinking about morality that has taken place, which is spiritually rich, but also allows the language to be humanistic enough so that the people who are coming from the secular perspective do not feel alienated. Of course, there are certain aspects of Buddhist thinking, which is like the rebirth and so on. That is, a different thing. But, those aspects of the Buddhist thinking, that really, grounds compassion as the foundation, I think will have an important role to play. And one advantage of doing that is when it comes to compassion, there's a consensus across all religious traditions, the major religious traditions, the fact that golden rule is the foundation of ethics and all the spiritual ethical teachings of the religions. Golden rules can be interpreted as an expression of fairness, but I would argue it is actually a principle of compassion, because to take golden rules seriously, you have to take into account the other person's needs and rights, and that is a compassionate consideration. So compassion underpins, moral values across all the traditions. And strikingly, when I was doing my work at Stanford, one of the amazing things was when it comes to defining what compassion is, there is a broad consensus between the spiritual traditions and contemporary psychology. But the economists and zoologists have a different definition. But the psychologists and the philosophers and the religious traditions, they have this almost exactly the same definition. Compassion has to do with perception of someone's need or suffering. It has to do with feeling for this other person, and it has to do with wanting to do something about it. Those three components are the main elements of compassion, and that comes up in pretty much in the definition of all the religious traditions. So compassion really, if the discourse on compassion is really developed fully, it really offers a very important ground on which not just all the religious traditions can come together, but in fact, I would argue the secular and the religious can come together, towards a shared goal of developing what one could call universal global ethics. So these are kind of things that I've been thinking about. Of course, my own book does not deal with all of this because it was written for a very, very general public. But I hope at some point I might be able to do something more academic along these lines. But I hope that there will be some PhD students who will have the patience and the time and the intellect and to really, dig deeply through this. And I think it will be a real, contribution because, I've been living in the West for a long time, and I truly care for what Western civilization has built. This whole liberal democratic society where the individual is, really respected, but that needs to be augmented, enriched by bringing this more communal, social, and ethical dimension. Thank you.
So I'll respond in a few minutes. It's my role tonight. And then I'll open it for discussion, and Dr. Jinpa will just take questions until I'll pop up again and tell everybody that, sorry, it's time to wrap up. So bring the bad news. Of what? Okay, sorry. My name is Eyal Aviv, and I'm teaching Buddhism. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. I'm teaching Buddhism and Buddhist courses and more general Asian religion courses at the Department of Religion and in the honors program. And I was so delighted when, we sort of, when we first came up with the idea of maybe course somehow and bring Dr. Jinpa to give a talk here, it was a long shot. We didn't really think that we'll be able to make it because he's probably one of the busiest people in the Western Hemisphere, one of them. But somehow, I don't know, the star aligned, exactly like that beautiful scenery just cleared up for us, auspicious, and it sort of materialized. So I'm so thrilled and I'm so happy that we were able to do that. Also, I sort of try to gather my thoughts and try to respond effectively. And what I have is a mess that I try to decipher of my own writing. So I'll try to do it very succinctly. First of all, I would like to really thank you for this great talk. And I started to read the book that you just wrote. I have my own copy, which is I warmly recommend it. So I want to touch upon that in conjunction with the talk that we just heard, and said how beautiful it is, both as a personal account of where you're coming from, which is deeply touching. When I read it, maybe it's a project for the future, but I thought this reads like a great movie. Really a fascinating topic of how you started from a small temple and all the family demands of your dad wanting you to stay and serve at that temple, and how, I hope that I'm right to propose it, but this restless intellect, right, just wanted to learn more and grow and learn English all by himself. I don't know how you did it. So it's really inspiring. And then from then, the really interesting work that has been done through the institute that the Dalai Lama initiated to collaborate between scientists and scholars from fields like philosophy and religious studies. So this book encapsulate a very nice dimension and capture a particular important facet that came out in the talk, the importance of compassion. So I wanted to say a few things about that. First of all, as someone who studied Buddhism, I have to say that this is something that I was also greatly attracted to. The idea that we grew up in a tradition, if you're coming from a Western perspective and study ethics from the Western perspective, we tend to approach ethics from the perspective of reason. How do we correct our impulses through thinking about them and using the reason to guide the emotions? But as Dr. Jinpa said so beautifully, very often, just looking at political rallies around the countries, right? Very often we do things acting on our impulses and then think, oh my God, what have we done, right? So reason is a very important tool, but if it's not guided and cultivated through learning how to direct our emotions skillfully, then here I'm quoting Arthur Schopenhauer, it's like trying to quench a huge fire with a syringe, right? That's how he thought about reason and trying to deal with the surging emotion, the emotional landscape that we have underneath us. So I think that this is really an important contribution of Buddhist approach to ethics, and some of my students here know that we read Shantideva, famous work from the 8th century. It's an Indian Buddhist who was one of the first one that I'm familiar with, who drew attention to the fact that if we want to think about ethic in a constructive way, we have to learn how to manage our emotional lives. And it's one of the question that I have that I would like to hear more of is about the part of the book where you worked with scientists in order to try to think of how do we actually do that? How do we reach deep down into our very, very deep-seated emotional landscape and trying to cultivate those states of mind that are more in line with the qualities that we would like to see in public life and in our individual selves. Also, another thing that I wanted to draw attention to is this tension that came up during the talk between our individualism, right? The fact that we are individuals and we have our individual impulses. We want to thrive, we want to succeed, and sometimes we are willing to, it's not us in the room, but other people, willing to step on other people in order to achieve their goal. And it's part of our human nature, right? But it's not it's not the entire story. So if you grew up on this Hobbesian notion of, men eat men, or women eat women, or men eat women, or whichever combination you want to draw upon, seems as a superfluous, maybe not really. Compassion may be some sort of like a quality that may become with external coercion, maybe some sort of like a divine command or something. And this is really reinforced by our science. So if you think back on the 1976 great classic by Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene, right? That was taken as a sort of like a Darwinian imperative. It's not just to us, right? It's coming from our genetic makeup. But at the same time, in the last few decades, we grow and learn more and more about science, and these paradigms was challenged too. So if you read works by even more contemporary biologists like Edward Wilson, for example, who challenge Dawkins' selfish gene hypothesis, he actually coming very much from the same perspective as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which showing that we do have competing impulses within us, and partially it's because the way that he referred to is our eusocial nature, right? We have the reptilian part of the brain, but we also humans, we are mammals. And as mammals, we also have the need to be eusocialized. We have the need to nurture, to show compassion. And those poles are always in tension, in many ways creating the kind of culture that we see around us today, right? And some peoples are pushing more those individualistic traits, and some other people pushing more for more eusocialized qualities like compassion. And we all want to see compassion. So again, going back to the question of how do we exactly cultivate it from a practical standpoint? Is it even desirable to get rid of our individualistic impulses altogether? From the perspective of global ethics, I want to point out historically that Buddhism also have a very important role to play in the development of thinking globally. Up until the time of the Buddha, and to remind you, this is a very early figure, right? We're talking about the 4th century BCE or 5th century BCE. Religious traditions tend to be very tribalized, right? If you go to ancient Judea, right, Judaism started as a religion of a particular people. If you go to India, Hinduism, what will become Hinduism later, was in the realm of the Dharma, where the Dharma is reigning, right, which namely in India. And if you're coming from an outside, you're just coming from a different story. Same thing in China, right? Confucius was talking about the culture of what he called in Chinese our own culture, right? The culture of the people under heaven, namely in China. And Buddha was the first person, as far as I know in the history, that said, no, actually everybody, every human being and every sentient being tend to suffer, right? Tend to share frustrations, tend to have physical and mental pain, and therefore my teachings is designed for everybody. Right? It doesn't really matter if it's Chinese or someone from Indonesia or someone from Rome. Everybody can benefit from that. So my question here is, this universal nature in Buddhism is also in tension with some trends that we see recently, right? So we know that universal ethics are also criticized sometimes as coming from the West and then imposed on other cultures. And I was wondering, what do you think about that? So I would leave it at that, and looking forward to further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eyal, for responding to my presentation and also for your thoughts. You asked 3 questions, and I don't know whether I can actually respond to all of them. I know that, let me take the 3rd one, which is the most sort of contentious one. Yes, you are right, there is this perception, particularly in the West, that universal discourse kind of Western hegemonic discourse, and which tends to often used by powerful, the ruling elite, to justify, their status quo and a kind of a narrative. And there's some element of truth in that. We're beginning to see this kind of being challenged now. But on the other hand, I would argue that, I don't know about other traditions, but certainly Christianity, the very idea of Catholicism, which means universal, the universal church, there is that notion. And of course in Buddhism, yes, because in the end, Buddhism, I know that, for example, a lot of Western therapists use, certain aspects of the Buddhist techniques to help in their therapy. But I always remind them that one of the things about Buddhism is that Buddhism is not really dealing with individual kind of, aspects of suffering. Buddhism is more interested in this universal level of suffering and coming up with an idea of a kind of a liberation at that very, very fundamental level. And at that level of conception of human being, we are stripped of everything: gender, race, ethnicity. Basically, we are looking at basic human condition driven by fundamental aspirations and needs and caring impulses, as well as afflictive impulses. So that once you have that kind of idea, then the ethics that is built on this, the whole spiritual practice that is built on this, is really built upon an assumption of a fundamentally shared human condition. And it will be a reality. And I personally, don't think some level of universality discourse, I don't think it's avoidable. Unless we are going to be willing to embrace such relativism that we will deny universality to basic emotions, we will deny universality to the experience of pain and suffering, we will deny universality to the whole experience of parenting and nurturing. I think it will be very difficult. I know the postmodernists sometimes tend to go in that direction, but I think it's a very intellectually, rationally difficult position to defend. Because that also, and sometimes those kind of discourse is motivated by social justice concerns and wanting to have dignity of the diversity and all the rest, but in the long run it tends to undermine that, because you are basically removing any basis for deep communication and interaction. So I tend to be more of a universalist in that sense. I mean, not in the kind of hegemonic sense, but I don't think any serious discourse that cares about human experience and human suffering can avoid some assumption of universality. So that's my view. Yes.
Should I just speak?
Yes. Yeah. There's
Oh, thank you. That's great. Okay. Well, I thank you very much for your talk, because I thought it was wonderful, and you've sort of identified what I think what many people think is the key challenge of our age. I mean, you have theologians like Hans Kung, the leading Catholic philosopher, who's written, "A global economy requires a global ethic." The late Václav Havel in the Czech Republic, he would write about if democracy is the Western notion of liberal society and democracy is to survive, we somehow need an agreement on common, universal, transcendent values. But where these transcendent values would come from is another question. Sort of to bring this line of reasoning to the question, there's a professor of religion, I don't know if he's still at Boston University, his name is Adam Seligman. A number of years ago, he wrote a book called Modernity's Wager, Ethics, Authority, and Transcendence, I think was the subtitle. And this book was a reflection on the notion that Western liberalism, democracy, what we think of as universal human rights, grounded in the Enlightenment and so on, which you talked about initially, notion of a social contract or the categorical imperative, which you mentioned. These are based on a secular notion of reason, and the whole Western project of liberal democracy and tolerance and individualism is based on these secular values, and he questions whether this can really hold without some agreed upon transcendent grounding or source of ethical values. His point being that even in the Enlightenment, with its secularizing approach, there was still a residue, psychologically and culturally at least, of shared values rooted in religion. And so in a globalized world, do you see any prospects for an agreement on a transcendent anchor? Because one can talk about global ethics being grounded in a shared perception of the inner nature of human beings. They suffer and so on. But some of these other thinkers point to the notion, well, we have to have a notion of the transcendent, a purely anthropocentric, psychological conception of humanity will inevitably disintegrates into tribalism, right-wing identity politics, which we're seeing rising around the world.
Can I just ask to keep the question shorter so that we'll have more time?
Okay, sorry.
Well, thank you for that very important question. This is a struggle. This is really the nux of the challenge of secular approach to thinking about ethics. In a way, the religious perspective has a kind of a trump card, which is the transcendence. You have a grounding that is absolute. Of course, it requires buying in. But once you have that buy-in, for the Buddhists, there's the concept of rebirth. Once you take that on, there's a kind of a trump card. Whereas the secular approach to ethics do not have that recourse. So then how do you ground your values in a way that is not too subjectivist? Because you have extreme subjectivism or relativism, basically. And this is one of the major criticisms of the religious, of the secular perspective. The secular view of, morality is if it feels good, it's right. If it doesn't feel good, then it's not right. I mean, that's a very emotivist, subjective kind of, perspective. So that is the crux of the challenge. But the proposal that Buddhism is bringing, and particularly what His Holiness is bringing, at least makes the promise. I don't know whether it delivers or not. That's, of course, the jury's out. But that makes the promise that you can have a robust notion of an objective grounding of these values without invoking a metaphysical transcendence. And that requires certain reconception of human nature and universality of certain conditions and aspirations and needs. So it's kind of a psychologically driven, one could say. It's more of a moral psychology-based approach. And, some philosophers call it a naturalized ethics. Anglo-American philosophers love this word, naturalization, naturalized epistemology, or naturalized this or naturalized that. And, I know that, there were some controversies about this particular thinker's, some of his research papers, but there is a book by Mark Hauser. He's a Harvard psychologist. He had been a little controversial lately because of it turns out that some of his data was, made up. But the basic line of argument that he develops in his book, Moral Minds, is actually quite a powerful one. And what he does is that in a way, he's arguing along similar lines of His Holiness, which is a kind of a naturalistic ethics, because we share with animals the impulse to avoid what is harmful. And what we seek, what is good for us, we kind of, we don't have to be taught. And the argument is that ethics is a higher level form of that same pursuit, what is, harmful and what is, beneficial. And it is a kind of a naturalization of the process. And I think, and what he does is that the unique thing about Hauser's work is that he uses Chomskyan linguistics and the concept of universal grammar, which gets manifested in different languages when exposed to different culture. But the basic kind of structure of the grammar, deep grammar, is universal. And he argues that there is similar universal moral grammar, which gets, of course, expressed differently when you're exposed to different cultural kind of conditioning. But, and one of the main arguments he brings is pretty compelling. He says that if you bring together people brought up in different cultures, and you expose them to moral dilemma. I mean, the philosophers love these thought experiments. Some of them are quite horrible. There is a person sitting on a bridge. There's a kind of a runaway cart. There's a person who's, a couple of people down there walking, and the only way in which you can kind of, save them is to throw someone so that it blocks the path. So what do? So there are thought experiments like this, and his point was that amazingly, there's the intuition, the moral intuitions of people across cultures. There's a high level of similarity. So he says that if you ask them explanations, then the moral reasoning differs. The reasoning differs based on how you are brought up. But the gut level of instincts, if they're asked to, that seems to be quite fairly, stable across. And that is his argument, which for me is quite compelling, actually. So I would argue, I've read, Hans Kuhn's book, the Global Ethic, and I was very impressed by the basic project. But I think, I would argue, and of course this is what His Holiness has argued, that we could get what we need, which is the kind of objective grounding of shared values without actually going that far and having to assume a transcendent grounding. Thank you. On this side, do we have another?
Oh, okay. How about on
Yeah,
that
okay.
side?
No, you can go ahead.
Well, okay, so, I'm just an ordinary housewife and I got kids and everything, but, aren't we just kind of overthinking all this stuff? I think a lot of the problems we have in this world are that people don't have clean water. Like Abraham Maslow's pyramid of needs. They don't have food.
It's true.
They don't have jobs.
True.
And they're scared. And they're frightened. And it's fear. And it just turns into fear, hatred, and delusion. And then those higher ethical principles, they just go out the door.
That's true.
That's why there's a pirate party in Iceland. The ruling elites were just fools. They got greedy, greed, hatred, and delusion. And so they're paying for it, So it's like, how can we get people so they can have clean water, a safe place to live, a house, and how can we do that as human beings? That, to me, is the morally conscious thing to do. And it starts right here in the backyard and in our towns and in our civic associations. Maybe you can
Thank you.
address that.
Yeah, that's definitely the most important question. In the end, all of this talk about ethics and compassion, if it doesn't translate into action, it doesn't really mean much. That's true. But the challenge is, how do we make people take that step? And often in these situations, you need people to care first. And to care for someone's needs requires being able to identify and empathize and understand the need. And this is one area where we have a lot of problem. And part of that problem from the Buddhist argument is that we haven't really been able to get to a point where our attitude is such that we will be able to, relate to whoever we meet. The first place from which we meet this other person is just at the level of being a human. And this is what makes someone like His Holiness so powerful, because you can see here is a person who, when he meets someone, the initial place at which where he meets is from another person, from a person to another person. And that, of course, requires, some kind of transformation. And, part of the thing is, of course, in the West, we are very busy. And we have chosen to create a way of life that prioritizes our independence and autonomy. And we have deliberately created a structure where we choose independence to the point where we would rather prefer to be left alone than being annoyed by someone. So, even the family relations are much more rationalized. You meet up on a specific time, you ring up. Whereas if you look at the traditional societies, it's much more organic. People knock on people's doors, and it's a much more organic system in which then this kind of not being able to relate to other and feeling of isolation isn't there. So, yeah, it needs a lot of work, but, thank you for bringing it out, because in the end, it has to start from an individual. It has to start from you. It has to start from me. And the first step to really feel and care for someone is to be able to identify, so that we don't, ignore it because we see someone is different. It's unrelated to me. I don't know if that answered your question, but thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I thought it was really good. I think there's a very common perception in the West of Buddhism as a very peaceful religion, philosophy. I think perhaps in no small part because of His Holiness's influential, just his influence. I was wondering if you care to comment on perhaps what distinguishes your body of thought with, such as in Myanmar, another Buddhist majority country, but you have some very militant monks, for example. I was wondering if you'd comment, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't think any religion is immune to violence. Even a avowedly pacifist religion like Buddhism, and there's even more pacifist version in India, Jainism, is probably the most pacifist. Although some of the Baptist traditions are very pacifist, but Jainism is almost pacifist to the point of being extreme, from a kind of a modern sensibility, But part of that is because religion, unlike philosophy, really taps into human emotions. And emotions are very powerful. And also, it doesn't really matter how much we have been modernized, acculturated, secularized. We are also a deeply tribal creature. And that tribal nature comes up, for example, if you have ever lived in England, in the football, soccer stadiums, where the two sides, and they get very violent. This is where, and they also feel a collective sense of identification, and they're able to transcend their narrow individuality, and it feels great. So those kind of, and religion becomes often an outlet for that. It becomes a basis of identity, and then you feel a sense of threat, and your tribalism kicks in. So I don't think even Buddhism is immune to violence. We saw that in Sri Lanka. There were monks involved in distributing matchsticks to Sinhalese nationalists to burn the Tamil homes. So we are beginning to see that we're actually seeing it in Burma, and to some extent in Thailand as well. So I think just because a particular religion has a message that is very peaceful does not inoculate the followers of that tradition from this vulnerability to human impulses. I think this is something that we have to remember. So hopefully, in these kind of situations, the religious leaders who are in a position of leadership, they need to speak out. So, for example, when the Burmese situation was brewing, I know that His Holiness personally wrote a letter to Aung San Suu Kyi. Please advise. And he also spoke out against the Buddhist monks, and he said, "This is not Buddhism. If Buddha were to be alive, just imagine what he would advise you." So this is where the leadership really matters. But just because a particular religion is pacifist, has deeply peaceful teachings, doesn't really guarantee that its followers are going to be immune. That's just too naive. Thank you.
Can I just ask for self-compassion? And I think we have time for one more question. And then we have reception, so we can continue the conversation.
Tashdale, thank you so much for your time, Thupten Jinpa. I recently saw a short video in which you were talking about compassion towards self and being kind towards yourself. And having gone to a Tibetan school called the Tibetan Children's Village, where the motto of the school is others before self, I just never heard of compassion being talked about that way. And I was wondering if you can expound on that a little bit, and also talk a little bit about how do you practice that in your day-to-day lives, and how do you then stop it from veering into the territory of being selfish?
Thank you. That's a very, very important question. And the reason why in my book, as well as that talk I gave, there's an important focus on the self-compassion, has partly to do with the audience that I'm trying to reach out. It's a really Western audience. And one of the things that I was quite struck through my work at Stanford and other places is the level to which, or the degree to which self-compassion is a problem for a lot of people. And I think, in Buddhism, there is very little discussion of actual self-compassion. But if you look carefully, self-compassion is kind of assumed. So the practice starts from this assumption of someone who has a self-compassion. But in the West, that assumption is just too much to make. And the interesting thing is that with self-compassion, if you are suffering from a deficit in that area, then sometimes what happens is that you tend to escape that need which is in you, and then you use your relationship with others as a way of, because you do need to express your nurturing side. And then at some point, because you're giving too much, so much, you feel exhausted. And sometimes in an important relationship where you have made a lot of investment, if things don't work out, you feel bitter. So having a self-compassion really protects you against it, because you are building an inner resource and reserve so that you have, a wonderful example of someone with a healthy self-compassion is someone like His Holiness. There's a real sense of ease with himself. He's perfectly comfortable in his body. And there is and you actually feel it when you're next to someone there is a sense of ease. There is a kind of a relaxedness about the energy around this person, because there isn't that anxiety, there isn't that heaviness, that sort of generally people tend to bring. So if you are able to cultivate self-compassion, where there is a ability to be kind to yourself, also ability to really see your own need and situation in the context of others, this is a very healthy self-to-self relationship. Self-compassion and narcissistic self-love are completely different. It may sound the same because love and compassion are similar, but actually, phenomenologically, it will feel completely different. Because when you have a narcissistic self-love, there is no place for others. There is no room for others. The focus is just on you. It's very narrow. Whereas when you are experiencing a sense of self-compassion, there is space for others. And you don't feel alienated. You don't feel disconnected. And it feels completely different. Narcissistic self-love and self-compassion would feel completely different. And same thing with self-pity. Self-pity is a form of the flip side of narcissistic self-love. Again, you wallow in your own, why me, why me, why me? It just becomes very narrow. But self-compassion and self-kindness has a completely different feel to it. So the more you are able to, because one of the things in the West I notice is that sometimes people are very conflicted about thinking about their needs. Because probably it has to do with thinking, oh, you shouldn't be selfish, it's bad, It's, you need to have a kind of a healthy balance. And this is one area, again, where Buddhism can make a contribution. Because in Buddhism, there isn't that sharp dichotomy between, self-interest and others' interest. So a truly compassionate action, having benefit to yourself, isn't a problem. Whereas in the Western conception of altruism and compassion, sometimes there is this feeling that if there is some benefit to yourself, somehow it's tainted. It isn't pure. The compassion and altruism should be actually, if anything, painful. So, and if it's not painful, it isn't morally kind of, valuable. So this is partly a cultural kind of thing, whereas and in reality too, the self-interest and others' interest are pretty interconnected. So I think self-compassion, so that's why I was trying to get at this, because if you are struggling in that area, it's very difficult to build a healthy, compassionate attitude towards others. Then we will leave our compassionate impulse just as a kind of a reactive response. When it's triggered, it comes up, but when it's not triggered, then it stays. Whereas if you have a healthy self-compassion, then you are able to build a resilience so that compassion can then become a proactive standpoint from which you can relate to others, so that it doesn't depend upon being triggered. Thank you.
I'd like to conclude by, I'd like to thank Dr. Jinpa for a wonderful talk, but I'd like to conjoin my thanks by making some observations here about Buddhism and our curriculum at GW. It's generally thought that there are 5 major religious traditions in the world, and Buddhism is one of them, and yet it's a religion that's underrepresented in our department at GW, the religion department. Eyal Aviv teaches some wonderful courses for us, but we share him with the honors program, which means that we really don't have nearly enough courses in this area. And that's not because of any fault of our own. In the religion department, it's that budgets are tight at GW and universities everywhere, and the first subjects that get neglected tend to be those that are in the humanities, and including religion. And we've repeatedly requested from the university to give us a position, a full-time position in Buddhism. I've personally lobbied for it, but we've been turned down every time. And I think that that's a mistake. It's a mistake because neglecting the humanities is a mistake. And in fact, just yesterday on the news, I heard that people who are graduating with degrees in the humanities actually do a lot better than they're given credit, and that there's a lot that you learn as a student in the humanities that employers actually value. It's also a mistake to neglect religion, because there may be no subject that is more important than religion. All you have to do is open up the newspaper and every day, and there's proof of that. And finally, it's a mistake to neglect Buddhism. It's a religion that represents 500 million people in the world, and in important regions in the world, particularly in China. I think this is something that we need to, be aware of. I should say China and Tibet. And I think that, my message here is that the university is not showing enough compassion on the religion department in giving us a position in this area. I think, and here's where I want to get back to Dr. Jinpa's presentation. I think that today's events is as good an argument as any that we really should have a position in that area. The sophistication of Dr. Jinpa's presentation is certainly proof that the study of Buddhism, belongs in the university in general, it belongs at GW more than it has, and that it is of great significance for the world in general. The attendance of everybody here today, this is a wonderfully, sizable audience for a late afternoon talk, is also proof of the importance of this subject. And so, it's evidence that Buddhism is clearly a subject of great interest and relevance. So I hope that this event is a step toward better representation of Buddhist studies at our university, and I thank you all for coming. And we're having there's a reception now. Please come to the reception. Again, thank you for coming. Hold on.
Sorry, I'll be directing traffic here, but if I could be indulged for just 1 second, I just want to say that I have been beating the drum for Thupten Jinpa to speak not just here at GW, but everywhere, more often, and I feel completely vindicated tonight. He has written this book on compassion, and he's just spoken so eloquently about compassion in practice. I think he's also, in his formal presentation, has talked about compassion as an idea. So when I think of Thupten Jinpa, actually, I don't think of compassion first, because we're hearing that a lot because of the book. I think of clarity, and I think of insight, and I think of, right now, for someone who studies contemporary Tibet, in the context of contemporary China and the modern Chinese state, we are heading towards a threshold. We are heading towards a really significant sea change, and as we transition, we're going to need the very brightest minds to be speaking up. In addition to the leadership, you said that the religious leaders need to speak up. We also need people like Jinpa to be speaking up. And so I just want to say that as we think in terms of how Tibetans and Chinese are going to be asking, how do we relate to each other? What is the basis of our connection to each other? I hope this conversation continues to expand. And thank you so much, Thupten Jinpa, for coming.